I was 34 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, when I first heard Deborah Whitmore laugh at me. Not a polite chuckle. A full-throated, theatrical cackle that echoed across the community center meeting room and made 19 other faces turn toward me with that particular blend of pity and second-hand embarrassment that makes your skin crawl. She actually slapped the table. Her tennis bracelet, and I mean the kind with actual diamonds, not the cubic zirconia nonsense, clinked against the fake wood veneer as she turned to the woman beside her and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "She thinks she can just waltz in here and tell us what to do. How precious. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments, because I need to know I'm not the only person who's dealt with these kinds of people." My name is Simone Baptiste. I'm a civil engineer specializing in stormwater management and erosion control, and on that humid evening in late May 2023, I just inherited my grandmother's house in the Willowbrook Estate subdivision. A tidy collection of 72 homes built in 1987 on what used to be tobacco farmland about 20 minutes south of Charlotte city center. The property sat on just under half an acre, a modest brick ranch with azaleas my grandmother had planted in 1989 and a magnolia tree that had been there since before the neighborhood existed. The house was worth maybe $340,000 in that market. Nothing spectacular, but it was mine. Or it should have been. I'd been working in Boston for the past 9 years, ever since graduating from NC State with my engineering degree. My grandmother, Celeste Baptiste, had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. She was Haitian-born, French-speaking until her dying day, and she'd worked as a waitress at the same French restaurant in Charlotte for 33 years. When she passed that March from complications of diabetes, I took a leave of absence from my firm and came back to settle her estate. The plan was simple: clean out the house, sell it, use the money to finally pay off my student loans and maybe, just maybe, put a down payment on something of my own back in Boston. But life, as my grandmother used to say in her thick Creole accent, "Li pa jan semp." It is never simple. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thinks they own you, hit that like button right now because you'll understand every word of what comes next. The first letter arrived on April 3, 2023, exactly 11 days after my grandmother's funeral. I was still sorting through her belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away, when I found it stuffed in the mailbox. Official letterhead. Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Below that, in bold, notice of violation and pending fine schedule. I remember standing there on the front porch, still wearing the oversized Duke sweatshirt I'd found in her closet that smelled faintly of her perfume, reading words that made absolutely no sense. The letter claimed that the property was in violation of Section 4.7b of the HOA covenants regarding landscape maintenance standards and Section 6.2 regarding exterior paint color approval. It demanded that I bring the property into compliance within 14 days or face fines of $100 per day, accumulating daily until resolution. I walked around the house 3 times. The grass was maybe 3 inches tall. I'd mowed it myself just 5 days earlier. The azaleas were blooming pink and healthy. The paint was a perfectly normal beige that matched at least a dozen other houses in the neighborhood. There was nothing wrong with anything. The letter was signed by Deborah Whitmore, HOA President, and countersigned by Richard Kensington, HOA Vice President and Architectural Review Committee Chair. A phone number was provided. I called it immediately. Willowbrook HOA, Deborah speaking. Her voice was clipped, professional, the kind of tone that told you she'd been waiting for your call. "Hi, this is Simone Baptiste. I just received a violation notice for 847 Meadowlark Lane, and I think there's been a mistake." "No mistake, Ms. Baptiste." She pronounced my last name wrong, putting the emphasis on the first syllable instead of the second. "The property has been in violation since early March. Your grandmother was given multiple notices, but she failed to respond. My grandmother had been in the hospital since late February. She couldn't have responded to anything. What specifically is in violation?" I kept my voice level, professional. This was somebody's power trip, nothing more. The grass exceeds the 3-inch maximum height requirement. The front azalea bushes extend beyond the approved setback line. And the house paint color was never submitted for approval when it was last painted. When was it last painted? A pause. We'll need to verify that information. The grass is definitely not over 3 inches. I measured it after I mowed last week. And those azaleas have been there for 34 years. Length of time doesn't constitute approval, Ms. Baptiste. And as for your measurements, I'm afraid the board conducted its own inspection and found them insufficient. You have 14 days from the date of the letter. Good day. She hung up. Comment below. Have you ever had someone hang up on you when you were trying to be reasonable? Because that was the moment I knew this wasn't about grass or paint or bushes. I'm an engineer. My entire professional life revolves around specifications, measurements, regulations, and documentation. I spent the next 3 hours going through every piece of paper in my grandmother's filing cabinet, and Celeste Baptiste kept everything. I found the original HOA covenants from 1987, recorded in Mecklenburg County. I found every annual dues payment receipt going back 20 years. I found architectural approval forms for a deck my grandfather built in 1994, for a fence installed in 2002, even for replacing the mailbox in 2015. What I didn't find was any previous violation notice. Not one. I also found something else. A stack of HOA meeting minutes from 2021 and 2022. My grandmother had attended nearly every meeting, and she'd taken notes in the margins in her careful, slanted handwriting. Next to the October 2022 minutes, she'd written in French, "Ils veulent ma maison." They want my house. The next morning, I drove to the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds office on East 4th Street in downtown Charlotte. It's a bland government building with that particular fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look vaguely ill, but the clerks there are efficient and helpful if you know what you're asking for. I pulled every document related to 847 Meadowlark Lane. The original deed from 1987, tax records, the recorded HOA covenants, plat maps, everything. Then I pulled the records for every property in Willowbrook Estates. If you're still with me, smash that subscribe button because what I found is going to make your blood boil. Over the past 18 months, the HOA had filed violation notices against 11 different properties. 8 of those properties had subsequently been sold, 6 of them to the same buyer. Whitmore Development LLC. I pulled the corporate registration. Principal Officer, Gregory Whitmore. Registered Agent, Deborah Whitmore. The HOA president was buying up properties in her own neighborhood. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. File violations for minor or non-existent infractions. Assess daily fines that accumulate quickly. If the homeowner fights back, make their life miserable until they give up and sell. Usually at below market prices because now the property comes with an HOA lien attached. Whitmore Development swoops in, buys cheap, pays off the lien, to themselves, renovates minimally, and flips for a profit. In the Charlotte market of 2022 to 2023, even modest homes were appreciating fast. I estimated they'd cleared at least $600,000 in profit from those 6 properties. My grandmother's house sat on one of the larger lots in the neighborhood, with mature landscaping and that massive magnolia tree. It was probably worth $340,000 as is, but with minor updates, it could easily hit $425,000. And my grandmother had owned it free and clear, no mortgage. They'd been circling her like sharks, and when she got sick, they struck. I took photographs of every document. I created a spreadsheet tracking every property sale, every violation notice filing date, every transfer to Whitmore Development. Then I went back to the house and measured everything myself. The grass, 2.7 inches average height. The azaleas, setback line was defined as 3 feet from property line, and the bushes were 3.4 feet back. I used my laser measuring device, accurate to 1/16 of an inch. The paint color, I found the original architectural approval from 1997 in my grandmother's files, signed by the HOA president at that time, approving Desert Sand number 842 by Sherwin-Williams. I went to the Sherwin-Williams on Pineville Matthews Road and had them scan a paint chip from the house. Perfect match. Every single violation was false. Share this with someone who's ever been lied to by people who think they have power over you. I drafted a response letter, citing specific covenant sections, attaching my measurement data and photographs, and including copies of the original paint approval. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. Then I did something my grandmother had taught me. I made copies of everything and stored them in 3 different places. The return receipt came back signed on April 21st. No response from the HOA. On April 28th, a man showed up at my door. He was maybe 60, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with Mecklenburg County Code enforcement embroidered over the pocket. His name tag said Williams. I need to inspect your property for reported code violations. What violations? He consulted his clipboard. Unpermitted structures, potential environmental hazards, and grading issues that may be causing drainage problems for adjacent properties. I am a civil engineer who specializes in stormwater drainage. My professional license literally qualifies me to evaluate grading and drainage issues. Who filed the complaint? Anonymous complaint. I still need to inspect. Here's something most people don't know. In North Carolina, code enforcement officers need either permission, a warrant, or evidence of an immediate safety hazard to enter private property. I know this because I've worked with code enforcement on at least 50 commercial projects. I asked to see his identification, wrote down his badge number, and politely declined the inspection. If you don't allow the inspection, I'll have to note that you refused to cooperate. Note whatever you need to. If you get a warrant, I'll be happy to comply. Until then, have a good day. His face flushed red, but he left. Turn on those notifications because this is about to get so much worse before it gets better. That evening, I drove around the neighborhood. Really looked at it. The houses were neat, well-maintained, the kind of middle-class southern subdivision where people put out American flags on holidays and kept their grass trimmed. About 60% of the residents were white, maybe 30% black, and the rest a mix of Asian and Hispanic families. It was the kind of place my grandmother had moved to because she wanted safety and stability, where she could tend her garden and walk to the neighborhood pool in summer. I noticed something else. 3 houses had for sale signs. All 3 were on larger lots. All 3 looked perfectly fine from the street. I knocked on the door of 831, Meadowlark Lane, 4 houses down from my grandmother's. A woman in her late 60s answered, Korean, with silver hair and suspicious eyes. Yes. Hi, I'm Simone Baptiste. I inherited my grandmother's house at 847, and I'm having some issues with the HOA. I noticed your house is for sale, and I wondered if you might have a few minutes to talk. Her expression shifted from suspicion to something like relief. She looked past me down the street, then opened the door wider. Come in quickly. Her name was June Park. She'd lived in Willowbrook since 1989. Her husband had passed away 2 years ago, and she'd been planning to stay in the house until her own kids convinced her to move closer to them in Virginia. That was the plan, anyway, until the HOA violations started. Let me know in the comments. Would you fight, or would you just walk away? Because June was ready to walk away. It started last summer, she told me, pouring tea in her immaculate kitchen. They said my fence was 6 inches too tall. 6 inches. My husband built that fence in 1993. Nobody said anything for 30 years, and suddenly it's a violation. Then it was the mailbox, wrong style, they said. Then the deck needed repainting. Then the driveway had cracks that were aesthetically unacceptable. The fines added up to $8,400 before I even understood what was happening. Did you fight it? I hired a lawyer. Cost me $3,000 just for him to write letters. The HOA wouldn't budge. They put a lien on my house. When I finally listed it, the only offer I got was from some development company for $285,000. This house is worth $360,000, easy. But with the lien and the violations, nobody else wanted to touch it. Her hands shook slightly as she set down her teacup. I'm supposed to close next week. The company is Whitmore Development. Don't close, I said. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. Give me 2 weeks. She looked at me like I'd suggested she sprout wings and fly. Sweetheart, I know you mean well, but Deborah Whitmore runs this neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She's connected. Her husband is some big contractor who builds half the commercial developments in Charlotte. Her son-in-law is a county commissioner. She's on the board of 3 different charities, and she golfs with the mayor. People have tried to fight her before. They all lost. If this makes you angry, hit that like button hard because it gets so much worse. I left June's house with a sick feeling in my stomach, but also something else. Clarity. This wasn't about one house or one violation. This was a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable homeowners, elderly people, people who'd lost spouses, people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. My grandmother had been dying, alone, probably receiving these threatening letters while she was too weak to even read them. They'd terrorized a 76-year-old woman in the last months of her life. I called my best friend from college, Marcus Chen, who'd gone to law school at UNC and now worked as a paralegal at a civil rights nonprofit in Durham. I explained the situation. Holy shit, Simone. This is textbook equity skimming. How much documentation do you have? 11 properties, sales records, violation notices for 6 of them, HOA meeting minutes, corporate filings linking the HOA president to the buying LLC, plus my grandmother's notes. I need to run this past my boss, but this might be something we can take on. The nonprofit angle is the discriminatory impact. If they're systematically targeting elderly homeowners and minorities, that's a Fair Housing Act issue. Give me 48 hours. I spent those 48 hours doing what I do best, engineering analysis. I mapped every property in Willowbrook Estates using GIS software. I color-coded properties by owner demographics, sale dates, and whether they'd received violations. The pattern was stark. Of the 11 properties that had received violations since 2021, 9 were owned by people over age 65. 7 were owned by minorities. 10 were owned free and clear with no mortgage. All 11 sat on lots larger than the neighborhood median. The targeting wasn't random. It was strategic. Drop a comment. Have you ever had to build a case against someone who thought they were untouchable? On May 2nd, I received a second letter from the HOA. This one was worse. It claimed that I'd failed to remedy the violations and that fines had begun accumulating on April 18th, 14 days after the first letter, which meant they'd completely ignored my response. The current total, $1,400. Additionally, the letter informed me that the HOA would be conducting a special assessment of my property to determine if additional violations existed, and that I was required to provide access on May 10th at 2 p.m., or face further fines and potential legal action to compel compliance. I called Marcus. They're accelerating. My boss wants to meet with you. Can you come to Durham tomorrow? I drove to Durham the next morning. The nonprofit was called Carolina Justice Partners, and they operated out of a converted house near Duke's campus. Marcus's boss was a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, 50-something, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of sharp eyes that told you she'd been fighting battles like this for decades. She reviewed my documentation for 90 minutes, asking pointed questions about timelines, specific covenant language, and my grandmother's mental state in her final months. Then she leaned back in her chair. This is good. This is really good. But I need you to understand what you're walking into. These people have resources. They'll make your life hell. Are you prepared for that? They already made my grandmother's life hell. I'm prepared. Okay. Here's what we do. Marcus will draft a cease and desist letter citing Fair Housing Act violations and demanding that all fines be rescinded and all violation notices be withdrawn. We'll threaten a federal lawsuit and send copies to HUD, the North Carolina Attorney General's office, and the Mecklenburg County Bar Association, since one of their board members is apparently an attorney. That'll put them on notice that you're serious. Will that stop them? Patricia smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. No. It'll piss them off. But it'll also create a paper trail that helps us later. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every conversation. Get a Ring doorbell camera. And find me more victims. If June Park is willing to testify, that helps, but I need at least 3 homeowners to make the pattern clear. Subscribe if you believe regular people should have a fighting chance against bullies with money. I installed 2 cameras that afternoon, one at the front door, one covering the driveway and street. Total cost, $380. My grandmother would have called it highway robbery, but it was the best money I spent. The cease and desist letter went out on May 5th, certified mail, with copies to all the agencies Patricia had mentioned. The return receipt showed it was signed for by Deborah Whitmore personally on May 8th. On May 9th, at 11:43 p.m., my Ring camera caught 2 people walking up my driveway. They were dressed in dark clothing, faces partially obscured by baseball caps. One of them spray-painted something on my garage door while the other stood watch. The whole thing took maybe 40 seconds. Then they ran. I watched the footage 3 times before I could even process what I was seeing. The word they'd painted, in 3-foot-tall red letters, bitch. I called the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. An officer arrived at 12:20 a.m., took a report, collected the video footage, and told me to file for a copy of the report for my insurance. He was polite but clearly uninterested. Probably kids, he said. You'd be surprised how often this happens. Check the footage again, I told him. Those aren't kids. He glanced at his phone. I'll make a note in the report. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen with all the lights on, watching the camera feeds on my phone, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. At some point around 3 a.m., I started crying, big, ugly sobs that I'd been holding back since the funeral. This house was supposed to be my inheritance, my grandmother's final gift, and these people were turning it into a nightmare. But then I thought about my grandmother standing on her feet for 8-hour shifts at that restaurant, smiling at customers who probably didn't even know she spoke 3 languages, saving every penny so I could go to college without debt. She'd fought her whole life. The least I could do was fight for this. Tell me in the comments, what's the bravest thing someone in your family ever did? The next morning, I pressure washed the garage door. The paint mostly came off, leaving a faint pink stain. Then I went to 3 more houses in the neighborhood, the ones with for sale signs. The first was owned by Robert and Linda Martinez, both in their early 70s. Robert had worked for the Charlotte Fire Department for 30 years. Their violation? An unapproved shed in their backyard. The shed had been there since 1995, built with HOA approval. But the HOA now claimed the approval documentation had been lost, and the shed exceeded current size restrictions. Fines, $3,200. They'd already accepted an offer from Whitmore Development for $298,000. The house was worth at least $370,000. The second was owned by a Vietnamese immigrant named Ton Nguyen, 78 years old, whose English was limited but whose daughter translated. Violations for excessive garden decorations and non-conforming fence height. The garden decorations were traditional Vietnamese wind chimes and a small Buddha statue. The fence was 4 feet tall, the exact height specified in the covenants. Fines, $5,600. No offers yet, but Whitmore Development had expressed interest. By that evening, I had detailed statements from 4 homeowners, including June Park. All elderly. 3 minorities. All targeted with false or exaggerated violations. All facing financial pressure to sell at below-market prices. I sent everything to Patricia. Her response came within an hour. This is a federal case. I'm bringing in a partner firm that specializes in housing discrimination. They'll work with us pro bono if we can get media coverage. Do you know any journalists? I didn't, but Marcus did. His cousin worked for the Charlotte Observer as an investigative reporter. Her name was Keisha Daniels, and when Marcus explained the situation, she was interested immediately. Hit that subscribe button if you think sunlight is the best disinfectant. Keisha met me at a coffee shop on May 12th. She was maybe 30, wearing a blazer over jeans, with a notebook and a recorder. She interviewed me for 90 minutes, taking detailed notes, asking for documentation, verifying every claim. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Why do you think they're doing this? beyond just the money. I thought about my grandmother, about June Park, about Ton Nguyen with his wind chimes and Buddha statue. Because they can. Because they think people like us won't fight back. My grandmother was a black immigrant who worked as a waitress her whole life. June Park is an elderly Korean widow. The Martinezes are Hispanic. Ton Nguyen barely speaks English. We're easy targets. And in their minds, we don't belong in their neighborhood. Keisha nodded slowly. I need to reach out to the HOA for comment before I publish. That's going to tip them off that this is going public. Are you ready for that? Do it. The article ran on May 18th, front page of the Metro section. Charlotte HOA accused of targeting elderly, minority homeowners in property scheme. It laid out everything, the pattern of violations, the connection to Whitmore development, the financial impact on homeowners, quotes from me and June Park and Robert Martinez. It included a photograph of my grandmother's house with the faded paint stain on the garage door still visible. The HOA's response, delivered through a lawyer, the Willowbrook Estates HOA categorically denies any discriminatory intent or improper conduct. All enforcement actions are taken in accordance with duly adopted covenants and are applied uniformly to all homeowners. Ms. Baptiste's allegations are baseless and defamatory, and the HOA reserves all legal rights. The article went viral locally. By that evening, it had been picked up by 3 Charlotte TV stations. By the next morning, it was on regional news across North Carolina. My phone started ringing, reporters, lawyers, other HOA victims from different neighborhoods, a producer from a consumer advocacy show on WCNC. And then, at 4:47 p.m. on May 19th, I got an email from an attorney representing the Willowbrook Estates HOA. Subject line, Notice of Intent to Sue for Defamation and Interference with Contract. The letter was 8 pages of legalese, but the message was clear: retract everything, issue a public apology, and pay $50,000 in damages for reputational harm, or they'd sue me into oblivion. Comment below. What would you do? Back down or double down? I forwarded the email to Patricia. She called me 10 minutes later, laughing. This is a slap suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. They're trying to intimidate you into silence. It's also incredibly stupid on their part because now we have evidence of retaliatory behavior, which strengthens our discrimination case. Do not respond to this email. Do not contact their attorney. Let me handle it. Are they actually going to sue me? Maybe. Probably not. But if they do, we'll countersue for about 15 different things, and we'll win. This letter is a gift, Simone. They are panicking. The next day, a different reporter called me, from WBTV, the CBS affiliate. They wanted to do a full segment on HOA abuse and asked if I'd be willing to appear on camera. I said yes. The segment aired on May 23rd during the 6 p.m. news. It was a 6-minute piece featuring interviews with me, June Park, and Robert Martinez, footage of our houses, and a breakdown of the Whitmore development connection. The reporter, a sharp woman named Amanda Cross, had done her homework. She'd found 2 additional neighborhoods in the Charlotte metro area where similar patterns had occurred, different HOAs, but the same playbook. In one case, an HOA president had been criminally charged with embezzlement. The segment ended with Amanda Cross standing in front of the Willowbrook Estates entrance sign. HOAs are supposed to protect property values and maintain community standards, but critics say some have become vehicles for personal profit and petty tyranny. If you believe you've been targeted by your HOA, you can report it to the North Carolina Attorney General's office. Amanda Cross, WBTV News. That segment was the turning point. Within 48 hours, the North Carolina Attorney General's office announced they were opening an investigation into potential unfair and deceptive trade practices by homeowners associations in Mecklenburg County. Share this if you think government should protect people, not just property. On May 26th, I attended my first Willowbrook Estates HOA meeting. It was held at the neighborhood clubhouse, a low-slung brick building near the pool with beige carpet and folding chairs. I walked in at 6:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the meeting started. Deborah Whitmore sat at a table at the front of the room, flanked by Richard Kensington and 2 other board members I didn't recognize. She was maybe 55, with the kind of aggressively maintained blonde hair and tennis-toned arms that telegraphed both time and money. She wore white capri pants and a pink polo shirt with a small designer logo. When I walked in, she looked up, and her expression was everything I'd expected. Contempt mixed with barely suppressed rage. "Ms. Baptiste, how kind of you to join us." Her voice dripped sarcasm. About 30 other homeowners were scattered around the room, most of them older, a few younger couples. I recognized June Park sitting near the back. She gave me a tiny nod. I took a seat in the front row, directly in front of the board table. The meeting started with standard business, approval of minutes, financial report, discussion of pool maintenance. Deborah ran it with brisk efficiency, barely letting anyone speak. When we got to new business, she glanced at her agenda and said, "I'd like to address the recent negative publicity that has been directed at this HOA by certain individuals." Every head in the room turned toward me. "These allegations," Deborah continued, "are not only false but deeply damaging to our community. This HOA has operated with integrity for over 35 years. We have never, and will never, discriminate against anyone. The enforcement actions we've taken are entirely consistent with our covenants, which every homeowner agreed to when they purchased their property. If certain individuals choose to ignore those covenants and then cry victim when they're held accountable, that's a reflection of their character, not ours." A few people in the room nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. I raised my hand. "This is not a question and answer session," Deborah said. "Actually, according to Robert's Rules of Order, which your own bylaws require you to follow, homeowners have the right to speak during meetings. I'd like 3 minutes, please." Deborah's jaw tightened. "You have 2 minutes. If you're rooting for me, smash that like button right now." I stood up and turned to face the room. "My name is Simone Baptiste. My grandmother, Celeste Baptiste, lived at 847 Meadowlark Lane for 36 years. She died this past March. Before she died, this HOA sent her violation notices for things that weren't actually violations. Grass that wasn't too long, bushes that weren't too close to the property line, paint that had been approved decades ago. When she was too sick to respond, they started assessing fines. When I inherited the property and tried to correct the record, they ignored my documentation and increased the fines. Then they sent code enforcement to my house on a false complaint. Then someone spray-painted my garage door in the middle of the night." Murmurs rippled through the room. Deborah's face flushed red. "In the past 18 months, I continued, this HOA has filed violations against 11 properties. 8 of those have been sold, 6 to a company called Whitmore Development, which is owned by the family of your HOA president. The pattern is clear: target vulnerable homeowners, harass them with bogus fines, pressure them to sell at below market prices, then profit from the sale. That's not community management. That's predatory behavior." "That is absolutely..." Deborah started to stand. I kept talking. "I'm a civil engineer. I specialize in regulatory compliance. I've spent the past month documenting every violation notice, every property sale, every covenant provision. And I've turned all of that documentation over to the North Carolina Attorney General's office, which is now investigating this HOA. So if anyone else in this room has received questionable violation notices, I encourage you to contact me or contact the AG's office directly. Because this stops now." I sat down. The room was silent for maybe 3 seconds. Then June Park stood up. "I want to speak." "Mrs. Park, this is not..." "I have lived here for 34 years, June said, her voice shaking but clear. "My husband and I raised our children here. We paid our dues, followed the rules, helped our neighbors. Last year, you sent me violation notices for a fence my husband built 30 years ago. You fined me $8,400. You put a lien on my house. You forced me to sell to your company for $75,000 less than it's worth. I trusted you, and you stole from me." Someone in the back started clapping. Then someone else. Within seconds, half the room was applauding. Deborah slammed her hand on the table. "This meeting is over. Everyone out. Now." But nobody moved. A man in his 40s, white, wearing a Carolina Panthers t-shirt, stood up. I got a violation notice last month. For my mailbox. I want to know if that's legitimate or if you're coming after me next. Another woman stood. My mother lives 3 streets over. She got a notice about her driveway. She's 81. Is she one of your targets too? The room erupted. Everyone was talking at once, shouting questions at the board, comparing notes about violation notices. Deborah tried to regain control, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Richard Kensington was on his phone, probably calling their lawyer. The other 2 board members looked like they wanted to disappear through the floor. I just sat there, watching, feeling something that might have been satisfaction or might have been the ghost of my grandmother laughing. Turn on notifications because this story is about to get even more insane. The meeting never officially resumed. People clustered in small groups, sharing stories. I gave my phone number to at least 15 homeowners. June Park hugged me, crying. Robert Martinez shook my hand and said, "You've got guts, kid." Deborah left through a side door without speaking to anyone. Over the next week, I received calls and emails from 23 homeowners in Willowbrook Estates. 14 had received violation notices in the past 2 years. 8 had paid fines. 2 had sold their homes under pressure. Every single one of them provided documentation, letters, photos, email chains. I compiled everything into a master file and sent it to Patricia, to Keisha at the Observer, and to the investigator at the Attorney General's office. On June 2nd, the Observer ran a follow-up article, Investigation Expands, AG reviewing complaints against multiple Charlotte area HOAs. The article mentioned Willowbrook specifically and noted that over 24 homeowners have now come forward with allegations of improper enforcement and discriminatory targeting. That same day, I received an email, not from Deborah's lawyer this time, but from a different attorney representing Whitmore Development LLC. Subject line, Settlement Offer. The offer, Whitmore Development would purchase my grandmother's property for $380,000, $40,000 over its appraised value. All violation notices would be withdrawn. All fines would be waived. In exchange, I would sign an NDA, withdraw my cooperation with the Attorney General's investigation, and issue a statement saying the matter had been resolved amicably. They were offering me $40,000 to shut up and go away. I called Patricia. They're trying to buy me off. Of course they are. What do you want to do? I thought about my grandmother, about June Park's tears, about all the people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. I want to burn it down. Patricia laughed. Good. Reject the offer. We're filing a federal lawsuit next week. Fair Housing Act violations, RICO Act conspiracy, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, the whole arsenal. We've got 4 plaintiffs now including you. And I've got a partner firm in Atlanta that specializes in class action suits. If we can certify a class, we're talking about potentially every homeowner in Willowbrook who's been affected. What are our chances? Better than 50-50. Maybe better than that. They fucked up by creating such a clear paper trail. And the media coverage helps. It shows a pattern and establishes public interest. But this is going to take time. Months, maybe years. Are you in? I'm in. Comment if you would have taken the money or kept fighting. Be honest. The lawsuit was filed on June 9th in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of North Carolina. Baptiste versus Whitmore, et al. 4 plaintiffs, me, June Park, Robert and Linda Martinez, and Ton Nguyen. Defendants, Deborah Whitmore personally, Whitmore Development LLC, Gregory Whitmore, Richard Kensington, and the Willowbrook Estates HOA as an entity. The complaint was 37 pages long, laying out the entire scheme with brutal precision. Patricia and her partner firm were asking for compensatory damages, punitive damages, attorney's fees, and injunctive relief prohibiting the defendants from serving on any HOA board in North Carolina. The news coverage was immediate. WBTV did another segment. The Observer ran it front page metro. By that afternoon, it was on regional news across the Carolinas and into Virginia and Tennessee. My phone rang nonstop for 3 days. More homeowners from Willowbrook. Homeowners from other neighborhoods with similar stories. Lawyers asking if I wanted to be represented. I already had Patricia, but I appreciated the offers. A producer from a national consumer advocacy show based in New York. And, weirdly, a literary agent asking if I'd ever considered writing a book. I also got hate mail. Lots of it. Anonymous emails calling me every racial slur you can imagine, plus a few creative new ones. Letters sent to the house, no return address, telling me I was a troublemaker, a race baiter, a greedy bitch who should go back to where I came from. One letter included a photograph of my grandmother's house with a red X spray painted over it. I gave all of it to Patricia and to the police. The detective assigned to my vandalism case, a black woman in her 40s named Detective Lisa Freeman, told me she was taking the threats seriously. She arranged for patrol cars to drive past the house more frequently. She also told me, off the record, "I'm glad you're fighting." My aunt went through something similar with her HOA in Rock Hill. They made her last years miserable. Somebody needs to hold these people accountable. Subscribe if you think the system should work for everyone, not just people with money and connections. On June 15th, the defendants filed their response to the lawsuit. It was a motion to dismiss, arguing that the plaintiffs had no standing, that the claims were frivolous, that the HOA had absolute immunity for its enforcement actions, and that the entire suit was a malicious attempt to extort money from well-meaning volunteers who donate their time to community service. Patricia filed an opposition brief the following week. The hearing on the motion to dismiss was scheduled for July 20th. In the meantime, life went on. I was still on leave from my engineering firm in Boston, living in my grandmother's house, sleeping in her guest room, eating off her dishes. I'd planned to be back in Boston by June, but that wasn't happening now. My boss was understanding. "Do what you need to do, Simone. Your job will be here when you're ready." But I knew I couldn't stay on leave forever. I also knew I wasn't going to sell the house. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. I spent my days organizing documents, fielding calls, giving interviews, and getting to know the neighbors I'd never really met before. The ones who'd lived next to my grandmother for decades but whom I'd only seen during occasional Christmas visits. They told me stories about Celeste, how she'd brought them homemade soup when they were sick, how she'd watched their kids after school, how she'd organized the neighborhood yard sale every spring for 20 years, how she'd spoken French to their children who were taking it in school, patiently correcting their pronunciation and laughing at their mistakes. "She was so proud of you," June Park told me one evening, sitting on my front porch drinking sweet tea. "She showed me your engineering diploma at least 5 times. She said you were going to change the world." I hadn't changed the world. But maybe I could change this little corner of it. On July 20th, I drove to the federal courthouse in Charlotte for the hearing on the motion to dismiss. It's an imposing building on West Trade Street, all glass and steel. The kind of place designed to remind you that justice is serious business. Patricia met me outside, along with Marcus and the lead attorney from the Atlanta firm, a man named David Kim who specialized in fair housing cases. "Just sit quietly and look sympathetic," David told me. "Let us handle the legal arguments. You're the human face of this case." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled, with the judge's bench elevated and the American flag in the corner. The defendant's legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits, sat at the other table. Deborah Whitmore was there, dressed like she was going to a country club luncheon. She didn't look at me. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. The defendant's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Hartley, argued that HOAs were private organizations with broad discretion to enforce their covenants, that there was no evidence of discriminatory intent, and that any claims of improper financial dealings were speculative conspiracy theories unsupported by concrete evidence. David Kim responded with a methodical breakdown of the statistical evidence, the demographics of targeted homeowners, the financial connections between the HOA board and Whitmore development, the pattern of below-market sales. He cited case law from fair housing cases in California, Texas, and Illinois where similar schemes had resulted in multimillion-dollar judgments. Patricia focused on the retaliation evidence, the vandalism, the threatening letters, the escalating fines immediately after I'd gone public. The judge, A woman in her 60s named Judge Elaine Thornton asked pointed questions. She seemed particularly interested in the connection between Deborah Whitmore and Whitmore Development. At one point, she asked Hartley directly, "Counselor, your client served as HOA president while simultaneously profiting from distressed sales of properties within that HOA. How is that not a conflict of interest?" Hartley stumbled through an answer about how the HOA board position was voluntary and uncompensated, so there was no legal prohibition. Judge Thornton looked skeptical. "I'll take this under advisement and issue a written ruling within 30 days. Anything else?" There wasn't. We left the courthouse cautiously optimistic. If you think justice might actually happen here, hit that like button. The ruling came down on August 8. Judge Thornton denied the motion to dismiss on all counts. Her written opinion was 22 pages, but the key passage was on page 17. Taking the allegations in the complaint as true, as the court must at this stage, plaintiffs have articulated a plausible claim that defendants engaged in a systematic scheme to target vulnerable homeowners based on age and race, using the mechanisms of the HOA to extract below-market property sales for personal financial gain. Such conduct, if proven, would violate both the Fair Housing Act and constitute actionable fraud under North Carolina law. The court finds that plaintiffs have standing, that their claims are not frivolous, and that discovery is warranted to fully investigate the allegations. Defendant's motion to dismiss is denied. We'd survived the first hurdle. Now came discovery, the process where both sides exchange documents, take depositions, and build their cases for trial. David Kim sent me a text, "Get ready. This is where it gets ugly." He wasn't kidding. Discovery in a lawsuit like this is brutal. Both sides can demand virtually any document related to the case. Emails, text messages, financial records, meeting minutes, personal correspondence, everything is fair game. Patricia and David submitted discovery requests to the defendants asking for all HOA financial records for the past 5 years, all violation notices issued since 2020, all communications between Deborah Whitmore and Whitmore Development, all emails and texts between board members regarding enforcement actions, all contracts and sale documents for properties sold to Whitmore Development, personal financial records for Deborah and Gregory Whitmore, policies and procedures for violation enforcement. The defendants fought nearly every request, claiming attorney-client privilege, invasion of privacy, trade secrets, every objection they could think of. We spent weeks filing motions to compel, arguing over what was relevant and what was protected. But we also got to issue subpoenas to third parties. We subpoenaed the bank records for Whitmore Development. We subpoenaed the County Code Enforcement Office for records of complaints against properties in Willowbrook. We subpoenaed the title company that had handled the sales to Whitmore Development. And we started taking depositions. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone lie under oath? Because I have. Deborah Whitmore's deposition was scheduled for September 14th. It took place in a conference room at the defendant's attorney's office, a sleek high-rise in downtown Charlotte with views of the city skyline. I wasn't allowed to attend, only the attorneys and court reporter, but Patricia gave me a full debrief afterward. "She's polished," Patricia said. "Very controlled, very careful with her words. She denied any discriminatory intent, said all enforcement decisions were made objectively based on covenant violations, and claimed she had recused herself from any board votes involving properties that might potentially be acquired by her husband's company. But here's the thing, the documentary evidence contradicts almost everything she said." Like what? Like emails we got through discovery where she literally tells Richard Kensington to target the park property. She's old and alone, she'll fold. Like bank records showing that Whitmore Development paid her personally a $45,000 consulting fee the same month they bought Robert Martinez's house. Like meeting minutes where she voted on enforcement actions for properties her company later bought, despite claiming she'd recused herself. So she committed perjury. Technically, she gave misleading testimony. Proving perjury is hard, but it destroys her credibility for trial, and that's what matters. Over the next 2 months, we deposed Richard Kensington, Gregory Whitmore, and 2 other board members. We deposed the code enforcement officer who'd shown up at my door. We deposed the title company representative who'd handled the sales. We deposed 3 homeowners who'd sold to Whitmore Development and felt pressured to do so. The picture that emerged was damning. This wasn't a rogue board member acting alone. This was a coordinated scheme involving multiple people, documented in emails and texts and financial transfers, targeting specific homeowners based on vulnerability. The defendants deposed me on October 3rd. I spent 7 hours answering questions, most of them designed to paint me as a troublemaker who'd blown minor disputes out of proportion for financial gain. Their attorney asked about my grandmother's health, implying she'd been mentally incompetent in her final months. He asked about my finances, implying I was motivated by greed. He asked why I'd gone to the media before attempting good faith negotiations with the HOA. I stayed calm. I answered truthfully. I didn't take the bait. Afterward, Patricia told me I'd done well. You came across as credible and sympathetic. That's all we needed. By November, both sides had exchanged expert reports. Our side had a statistician who'd analyzed the demographics of targeted properties and concluded there was a 97% probability that the pattern was not random. A real estate appraiser who'd calculated the below-market values of the forced sales and estimated total losses to homeowners at $670,000. A forensic accountant who'd traced the money flows between the HOA, Whitmore Development, and the Whitmores personally, finding multiple undisclosed conflicts of interest. Their side had an HOA management consultant who testified that the enforcement actions were consistent with industry standards. Their own real estate appraiser who claimed the sale prices were fair market value given the condition of the properties and the liens attached. In December, Judge Thornton issued a ruling on our motion for class certification. She granted it, certifying a class of all current and former homeowners in Willowbrook Estates who received violation notices and/or were assessed fines by the HOA between January 1, 2021, and the present. That expanded the potential plaintiff class to 47 homeowners. The defendants immediately filed an appeal of the class certification to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Their goal was obvious: delay, 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 hoping we'd run out of resources or patience. But we didn't. Subscribe if you believe persistence beats power every time. By January 2024, the case had been pending for 7 months. The legal bills were mounting. Even with Patricia's nonprofit and the pro bono help from David Kim's firm, there were costs. Filing fees, expert witnesses, deposition transcripts, travel. I'd burned through most of my savings. But something else was happening. The media attention had sparked a broader conversation about HOA abuse across North Carolina. The state legislature introduced a bill, the Homeowner Protection Act, that would require HOAs to provide detailed justification for fines, create an independent appeal process, and mandate disclosure of board members' financial interests. It wasn't a perfect bill, but it was something. The Attorney General's office had expanded its investigation beyond just Willowbrook. They'd found similar patterns in 3 other Charlotte area neighborhoods and 2 in Raleigh. In one case, they'd referred the matter to the FBI for potential wire fraud prosecution. And homeowners were fighting back. I started getting emails from people across the state, and then across the country, who'd seen the news coverage and wanted advice on battling their own HOAs. I couldn't help everyone, but I connected people to resources, shared our legal strategies, and told them what I'd learned: document everything. Find allies. Don't fight alone. In late February, the defendants made another settlement offer. This time, it was serious. $2.3 million to be divided among the class members, with the largest shares going to the named plaintiffs. Deborah Whitmore would resign from the HOA board. Whitmore Development would agree not to purchase any more properties in Willowbrook Estates for 5 years. And the HOA would implement new governance policies drafted by an independent consultant. Patricia called me to discuss it. This is a good offer, Simone. It's real money. It compensates the victims. It reforms the HOA. You could take this and walk away with probably $200,000 after attorney's fees and class distribution. That's enough to pay off your student loans, keep your grandmother's house, and still have money left over. What about Deborah? What about Gregory? Do they face any consequences beyond losing money? Not criminal consequences. No. The AG might pursue civil penalties separately, but that's not guaranteed. This settlement is about making the victims whole, not punishing the wrongdoers. I thought about it for 3 days. I called June Park, Robert Martinez, Ton Nguyen. I called Marcus and asked what he thought. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen and tried to imagine what she would have wanted. On February 28th, I told Patricia to reject the offer. I want this to go to trial. I want a jury to hear what they did. I want a public record of their wrongdoing. And I want real consequences, not just a payout and a resignation. Because if we settle now, they'll just do this again somewhere else. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, but you need to understand, trial is a risk. We could lose. Juries are unpredictable. And even if we win, appeals could drag this out for years." I understand. All right then. Let's go to trial. Drop a comment. Would you have settled or rolled the dice on a trial? The trial was scheduled for June 3, 2024. We spent the spring preparing, reviewing documents, prepping witnesses, refining our arguments. David Kim was going to handle the opening statement and the examination of the expert witnesses. Patricia would handle the homeowner witnesses and the cross-examination of Deborah Whitmore. I would testify about my grandmother, about the harassment I'd experienced, about why this mattered. On the Friday before trial, I visited my grandmother's grave at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Charlotte. It's a peaceful place, old trees and rolling hills, the kind of place she would have liked. Her headstone was simple, Celeste Baptiste, 1947 to 2023. Beloved grandmother. No Sonia ou. We remember you. I sat there for a long time, telling her about everything that had happened. About the lawsuit, the media coverage, the other homeowners who'd found the courage to fight back. About how her house, our house, had become a symbol of resistance against bullies. I hope I'm making you proud, Grandmere, I whispered. I hope this is what you would have wanted. The wind rustled through the magnolia trees, and for a moment, I could almost hear her voice. Contini Gauman, Shuri. Oukafisa. Keep fighting, darling. You can do this. On Monday, June 3, 2024, the trial began. The courtroom was packed. June Park, Robert and Linda Martinez, Ton Nguyen and his daughter, Marcus, Keisha from The Observer, several TV news crews, and at least 30 other Willowbrook residents. Deborah Whitmore sat at the defense table in a conservative navy suit, her face a mask of composure. Gregory Whitmore sat behind her, looking grim. David Kim's opening statement was masterful. He laid out the scheme step by step, using a PowerPoint presentation with timelines, photographs of the targeted homes, and charts showing the money flow. He introduced each plaintiff and explained what they'd lost. He ended with a rhetorical question: how many families have to be victimized before we say enough is enough? The defense attorney, Hartley, argued that this was a case of Monday morning quarterbacking, claiming that every HOA enforcement decision was made in good faith based on the information available at the time, and that any suggestion of discrimination was an offensive and unfounded smear against dedicated community volunteers. The first witness was June Park. Patricia walked her through her entire experience, the violation notices, the accumulating fines, the pressure to sell, the below-market offer from Whitmore Development. June cried on the stand when she described telling her children she had to leave the home where they'd grown up. The defense cross-examined her aggressively, implying she was a willing participant who'd been happy to take Whitmore Development's money. But June held firm. I didn't want to sell. You forced me. Hit subscribe if you think ordinary people deserve to be heard. We put on witness after witness. Robert Martinez testified about the unapproved shed that had been approved in 1995. Ton Nguyen's daughter translated as he described the violation notices for his garden decorations. They said my Buddha statue was religious proselytization. It's a garden decoration. I'm Buddhist. It's my faith. Our statistician testified about the demographic patterns. Our real estate appraiser testified about the below-market sales. Our forensic accountant testified about the money trail. And then it was my turn. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days. I described my grandmother's life, her work, her pride in her home. I described finding the violation letters, the harassment, the vandalism, the threatening emails. I walked the jury through my investigation, the documents I'd found, the pattern I'd uncovered. Patricia asked me, "Why didn't you just sell the house and move on?" Because my grandmother spent her entire life fighting to build something stable for our family. She survived poverty in Haiti. She survived being an immigrant in a country that didn't always welcome her. She survived decades of hard work to buy that house and make it a home. And these people tried to steal it from her when she was dying. I couldn't let that stand. Not for her. And not for everyone else they'd hurt. I looked directly at the jury when I said it. Several of them nodded. The defense cross-examination tried to paint me as vindictive and opportunistic. Hartley asked if I'd enjoyed the media attention. He asked if I'd been motivated by the possibility of a financial settlement. He asked why I hadn't accepted the HOA's generous settlement offers. Because this isn't about money, I said. It's about accountability. It's about making sure they can't do this to anyone else. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The defense put on their HOA management consultant, their appraiser, and several Willowbrook residents who testified that they'd never experienced any problems with the HOA. They tried to portray Deborah as a well-meaning volunteer overwhelmed by the demands of managing a neighborhood. But then Patricia cross-examined Deborah, and it was devastating. Patricia walked her through the emails, the ones where she'd discussed targeting specific properties, the ones where she'd coordinated with her husband about which houses to buy, the ones where she'd dismissed complaints from minority homeowners as whining. Patricia showed her the bank records proving she'd received consulting fees from Whitmore Development for properties the HOA had forced into distressed sales. Mrs. Whitmore, you testified in your deposition that you'd recused yourself from board votes involving properties your husband's company might purchase. But here's the meeting minutes from August 15, 2022, showing you voted to assess fines against the Martinez property. And here's the sale contract showing Whitmore Development purchased that same property 3 months later. Were you lying in your deposition, or are you lying now? Deborah's composure cracked. I don't remember that specific vote. There were many votes. Convenient memory, Patricia said. The defense objected. Judge Thornton sustained it. But the damage was done. The closing arguments happened on June 21st. David Kim spoke for 90 minutes, weaving together all the evidence into a coherent narrative of greed, abuse of power, and discrimination. He asked the jury to award compensatory damages to make the victims whole and punitive damages to send a message that this behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Hartley's closing was defensive, arguing that mistakes had been made but there was no proof of intentional wrongdoing or discriminatory motive. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. Share this with someone who's ever waited for a verdict on something that mattered. On June 24, 2024, at 3:47 p.m., the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The jury found that the defendants had violated the Fair Housing Act, committed fraud and conspiracy under North Carolina law, and intentionally inflicted emotional distress on the plaintiffs. Compensatory damages: $1.8 million to be divided among the class members. Punitive damages, $4.2 million, to be paid by Deborah Whitmore, Gregory Whitmore, and Whitmore Development jointly and severally. Total verdict, $6 million. The courtroom erupted. June Park grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard I thought my bones would break. Robert Martinez was crying. Patricia and David were hugging. Even Judge Thornton, normally stoic, allowed herself a small smile. Deborah Whitmore sat frozen, her face pale. Gregory stormed out of the courtroom. After the jury was dismissed, Judge Thornton issued additional injunctive relief. Deborah Whitmore was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in North Carolina. Whitmore Development was prohibited from purchasing any property in Willowbrook Estates for 10 years. And the HOA was required to implement comprehensive governance reforms, including independent oversight and a transparent appeals process for violations. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed us. Cameras, microphones, reporters shouting questions. Patricia gave a statement thanking the jury and praising the courage of the plaintiffs. David talked about the broader implications for HOA reform. When they asked me to speak, I thought about my grandmother. About her voice, her strength, her refusal to be diminished. And I spoke in French first, then English. Ma grandmère disait toujours, la vérité est comme elle voile, elle finit toujours par remonter à la surface. My grandmother always said, the truth is like oil, it always rises to the surface. Today, the truth rose. Today, justice was served. Not just for my grandmother, but for every person who's ever been pushed around by bullies who thought power meant they could take whatever they wanted. This verdict says no. You can't. Not anymore. The clip went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 2 million times on various platforms. News outlets across the country picked it up. I got interview requests from Good Morning America, CNN, NPR. The North Carolina Attorney General issued a statement praising the verdict and announcing criminal charges against Deborah Whitmore for embezzlement and fraud. Hit that subscribe button if you believe one person can make a difference. The aftermath was complicated. The defendants filed an appeal, of course, but their insurance company eventually settled the appeal for $5.5 million to avoid further litigation costs. The class members received their compensation. June Park got $187,000, enough to buy a nice condo near her daughter in Virginia. Robert and Linda Martinez got $156,000. Ton Nguyen got $143,000. I got $340,000 after attorney's fees, enough to pay off my student loans completely and still have money to renovate my grandmother's house. Deborah Whitmore filed for bankruptcy. Whitmore Development dissolved. Gregory Whitmore's construction business lost several major contracts after the verdict. In November 2024, Deborah pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation. The North Carolina legislature passed the Homeowner Protection Act in September 2024. It wasn't perfect, but it created real safeguards against HOA abuse. And Willowbrook Estates? The neighborhood elected a new HOA board, one that included June Park and Robert Martinez. They rescinded all outstanding violations, refunded fines that had been improperly assessed, and implemented the governance reforms Judge Thornton had ordered. It's not paradise, but it's better. I decided to stay in Charlotte. I took a job with an engineering firm here, specializing in municipal infrastructure projects. I still live in my grandmother's house. I repainted it, the same Desert Sand number 842, approved in 1997. I replanted the azaleas where they'd gotten damaged. I sit on the front porch sometimes in the evenings, drinking sweet tea, watching the neighbors walk their dogs, and thinking about how close I came to walking away from this fight. I think about my grandmother every day. I think about her strength, her grace, her refusal to let anyone make her feel small. I think about all the people who came before me who fought battles I'll never know about, who stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. And I think about the people who reached out after the trial, hundreds of them, from across the country, telling their own stories of HOA abuse, asking for advice, finding courage to fight back. Some of them won. Some of them lost. But they all fought, and that matters. Subscribe right now because next week's story is about a city council, a corrupt developer, and how one retired Army engineer used a 200-year-old property law to stop a $60 million land grab. You won't believe how it ends. My grandmother used to tell me a Haitian proverb, Paitai paitai oiseau fe niche. Little by little, the bird builds its nest. We don't change the world all at once. We do it little by little, one fight at a time, one victory at a time, one person finding the courage to say no more. This was my fight. This was my victory. Not just for me, but for Celeste Baptiste, who spent her life building a nest for the people she loved. And for every person who's ever been told they don't matter, that they should just accept injustice, that they're too small to make a difference. You're not too small. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And sometimes, when you speak the truth, even when your voice shakes, even when you're terrified, even when the odds seem impossible, the whole room goes silent. And they listen. Comment below and tell me, what's your fight? What's the thing you're not willing to walk away from? Because I promise you, somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that they're not alone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that regular people can win against powerful bullies. Hit that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you next week. No Sonia OU, Grandmere. We remember you. And we keep fighting.